If you enjoyed this program, please like and subscribe. You have no idea how hard your church works to keep you in the church.
Yeah, my name is Bob from New York. My question is, in the birth narratives in Matthew and Luke, do they both mistranslate the word virgin, Betula, for Alma? And also, if they were copying each other and they both have a birth narrative, why is there so many differences in Luke's birth narrative than in Matthew's, where he has them going to Egypt and he has them, Herod and Star and all that stuff? Well, why would they be so different if one didn't copy from the other, or was it just an oral story going around at the time? So that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, those are a great series of questions. The first question is the easiest. There are 27 books in the Christian Bible, and only 2 of them state that Jesus was born of a virgin, Matthew and Luke. The other writers of the New Testament make no such claim, and where we would expect to find it would be the book of Mark, because it's a gospel. The gospel purports to tell about the life and death of Jesus, and so it's not there. The idea of a virgin birth develops in the 80s, but the key point is that there are 89 chapters in the Gospels, and only 4 of them, 2 in Matthew and 2 in Luke, contain an infancy narrative. The notion that Jesus was born to a virgin named Mary in the city of Bethlehem, and that's where the similarities end, which go to your point. While Matthew employs fulfillment citations, he has 11 of them, where he says in Matthew 1:23 that Jesus' conception to a virgin is not just an arbitrary event, but it's a fulfillment of what it says in the prophet Isaiah. And here in Matthew 1:23, Matthew famously misquotes Isaiah 7:14, where the Hebrew says, "Behold, the young woman is with a child, and she will bear a son, and she will call him Emmanuel." Matthew famously changes the text and says, "Behold, a virgin." So the most obvious thing is it doesn't say a virgin, it says a young woman. It is young women that have babies as opposed to old women. So he puts in the word virgin. The word virgin is not in the Hebrew. There's only one way in biblical Hebrew and modern Hebrew to convey virginity, and that's the word betula. So you got that right. Matthew deletes the definite articles. Behold, a virgin shall conceive, also changing the tense. And also it says she will call his name Emmanuel. In the original Hebrew, v'karat shemo Emmanuel. V'karat means and she will call. Matthew will have none of that either, because after all, Mary never called Jesus Emmanuel. So if you read Matthew 1:23 carefully, it says they will call his name Emmanuel. And of course, it's ripped out of context completely, and the sign isn't the conception or birth. The sign follows in the next 2 passages, which no Christian reads. It's Isaiah 7:15 and 16, where it tells us that the child will be eating butter and honey, 2 foods that are cultivated in some way. It means we'll be free, the war will be over. When the child knows to reject bad and choose good, before that'll even happen, these 2 kings that you abhor, in this case it's the Ephro-Syria war, so the king of Ephraim is Pekach ben Ramalyahu, and the king of Syria is Ritzin. None of this has anything to do with anything that happened 700 years later. Isaiah lived about 700 years before the Christian century. So Matthew just rips this passage apart and out of context mistranslates it. If you're a Christian, You should really send a big donation to your church, a lot of money. You have no idea how hard your church works to keep you in the church. You have no idea how many mistranslations have been loaded, packed into your NIV, King James. You should send them a lot of money. They work really hard in their translations to make sure that you stay in church. So if you enjoy church, they work very hard. Don't think this is a lot of work to completely reconstruct the text. Now, as it turns out, Luke, as I mentioned earlier, also claims that Jesus was born to a virgin. However, Luke does not use any verse or any passage to substantiate that, to bolster that claim, because that's not Luke's style. That's Matthew's style. It's not Luke. It doesn't mean that Luke never quotes or misquotes a verse in the Hebrew Bible. He does, but he doesn't do it in the way that Matthew does. Matthew says this is to prove, this is to fulfill what was spoken of the Lord. That's Matthew. So Luke does not do this. That's not the way the book of Luke was written. Now, Luke has in view the reason why did Jesus need to be born of a virgin? Why was it important? So Luke does tell his reader why it was critical. And that's found in the Annunciation, where Mary is told by the angel Gabriel that she's a virgin and yet she's going to have a baby. Mary, of course, said to the angel in chapter 1, verse 34, how is this going to be? Meaning, how am I going to get pregnant? I'm a virgin. And the angel, Gabriel, again, this is the Annunciation, answered her, listen very carefully, the Holy Spirit will come upon you and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Now, this is very important. Therefore, the child to be born will be called Holy, the Son of God. So why is the word therefore? Why does he say therefore? So this is very critical. As far as Luke is concerned, Jesus is the Son of God because he was born to a virgin. That's why it's therefore. That's why therefore is there. To tell you that he is the Son of God. The virgin birth enables Jesus to be the Son of God. That's very critical to Luke. That's found right in the Annunciation, chapter 1, verse 35. Now we get very interesting. Luke did not copy Matthew. If Luke had ever seen the book of Matthew, and they're both written at about the same time. We don't know where either of them lived. We don't know who they are. Both of them are anonymous, so they're not claiming to be somebody that they're not. We just don't know. It was the church father in the late 2nd century, Irenaeus, the Bishop of Lyon, who will identify the names of these gospels, who will say that Matthew is the author of the first gospel, Mark second, Luke, and so on. This is much later, and these guys are Roman Catholic. This guy was a Roman Catholic, totally proto-Orthodox Roman Catholic. Protestants rely on Roman Catholics for the content of the canon and for these features like ascriptions. Now, Luke, whoever wrote the book of Luke, was not using one source, he was using many sources, but that source did not include Matthew. If Luke would have seen Matthew, you're right, his infancy narrative would be completely different. Let me make a point here. There are many variances in the Christian Bible. You want to call them contradictions, they're just variances. There are many of them. It's very, very famous that the passion narratives are very, very different in the Gospels, okay? And many of you are aware of some of those variants. Some of them I don't think are very important. How many women come to the tomb Sunday morning? 2. Matthew, 3, Mark, more than 4, Luke, 1, John. That's not important. It really is not. Don't pay attention to that. There are some others that are really contradictory, that are stunning, okay? No matter what you uncover in the Passion narratives, no matter what contradictions you discover in the Passion narrative, and there are a lot of them, I chart them out in the first volume of Let's Get Biblical. There are a lot of them. These contradictions pale in comparison to the contradictions between Matthew and Luke. In fact, the difference between Matthew and Luke is not that they contradict each other. They're just completely different stories. Completely. Where was Mary and Joseph from? What was their original home? Where do they come from? Where do they start out? It depends. According to Luke, their hometown was Nazareth. That's where they start out. And they have to get to Bethlehem because there was a census. They arrive in Bethlehem and there's no room, there's no hotel room. So they have to, Mary gives birth in a barn. Jesus is born in a manger. And following the birth and all the in-between stuff, the family makes their way back home, stopping off along the way in Jerusalem for Mary to bring the requisite offerings. There it is, a month later. Matthew has the family start off in Bethlehem. That's why there's no issue about Jesus being born in a barn and there's no room in the inn and none of that. Home is Bethlehem. Now, they both want him born in Bethlehem because they both want him to be born in the city where King David was born. See 1 Samuel chapter 17 as an example. David HaMelech, King David, was born in Beis Lechem in Bethlehem, so they wanted to. But how they get that, another term that's better, they each independently use a different plot device to make this happen. And they are completely different because with Matthew, the family starts off in Bethlehem, not Nazareth. And Herod the Great wants to kill Jesus because, see Matthew 2, verse 13 through 15, because he was told that the King of the Jews is born in Bethlehem, and Herod, after all, is King of the Jews. He doesn't want competition. So all the children in Bethlehem are killed by Herod. I'm not going to bother telling you that there's no historical anything support for this. This is completely made up. So the family flees. They don't go to Nazareth, go to Jerusalem or any of that stuff on Luke, but they head down to Egypt and were there until the death of Herod with another citation. Okay, so they're in Egypt, and then Herod dies, so Joseph thought, well, we now can go back home. Where? To Bethlehem. But he is informed by the angel that, in fact, you can't go back to Bethlehem because Herod's heir is Herod Archelaus, who was crazier than his dad. He was insane. You can't go back to Judea. That's what Bethlehem is. Just get a sense, if you look at a map, Jerusalem roughly is in the middle of Eretz Israel. Beis Lechem, Bethlehem, is just a little south, so it's still in Judea. And if I tell you this, I didn't figure this out, but Bethlehem and Jerusalem are so close that it would be a very long walk, depending on what part of Jerusalem you're in, but you can walk from Jerusalem to Bethlehem in a day. I don't know how long it'll take, but no traffic, it's whatever. It's very close, okay? 10, 15 minutes you're there. Hebron is a little further still in the heart of Judea. So in Matthew, they then go to Nazareth because they can't go back home. You understand? They're so different. So Matthew and Luke did not copy each other. However, that said, they both had sources that they used. So Matthew and Luke have a lot of material that's very similar. And they're getting that similar material from two sources. I want to change that word similar and replace it with identical or nearly identical. It's not similar, so I want to change that. They're identical. So number one, both Matthew and Luke had the book of Mark in front of them and copied almost all of the 679 passages in the book of Mark. The book of Mark is much smaller. And that's not all of the book of Mark, but almost all the book of Mark appears in both Luke and Matthew. So they both copied Mark. But here's where it gets interesting. There are passages that appear both in Matthew and Luke, but do not appear in Mark. So they obviously had another source for those passages that they took from. It's more than 200 passages. And those passages that are common to Matthew and Luke, but do not appear in the book of Mark, are called a source. We do not have the original source document independently, and that's why it's called the source document, or Q for the German word for source. Okay? Now, it's interesting. This is very interesting. This source, why is this important? Well, for many reasons you can imagine. One of them is it is quite likely that this source that both Matthew and Luke had access to, but Mark did not, is older than Mark. So that's why this is very intriguing. So Luke had those two sources, which Matthew had, but then there's material that's completely unique to Luke, which is nowhere to be found in Matthew. As an example, in the infancy narrative that we're discussing, so it's Mary that's receiving this information from the angel, not Joseph, as you would find in Matthew. The discrepancy of where does the family start out, there's no room, that's all L source material, So so we call that an L, meaning stuff that is material that is completely unique to Luke, but is not to be found in Mark or Matthew. Conversely, or Q, there's material in Matthew that's not to be found in Luke, so that is called the M source. There have been scholars that wanted to suggest perhaps Luke copied Matthew and Mark. The reason why that's attractive is it removes one hypothesis for the Q source. And logically, if you can remove a hypothesis, so it's an Occam's razor issue, it's more likely to be correct. The reason why this is extremely unlikely is because it is inconceivable that Luke would have taken a glance at Matthew and would have written his infancy narrative that way. Now, I'm not going to go further with you because it'll get too complicated. There are some people who have theorized that, in fact, the first 2 chapters of Luke were not original. We have no manuscript data to support that at all. But Luke could begin with chapter 3, and you don't need 1 and 2. I don't believe that, and I don't know of many people who do either. So that's what's going on. Now, how did this develop, and why did it develop about the virgin birth? So that's not hard to figure out, because in the ancient world, the term Son of God meant something. I'm not talking about the Jewish world. The Jewish world, every person is the son of Hashem. Bonim atem l'Hashem elikechem. You are children of the Lord your God. Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 1. We're all children of Hashem. Doesn't mean you're divine, except that every human being, Jew or Gentile, has a neshama, has a chelk mimal mamish, has a soul, a divine spark, is created in the image of Hashem. Only caveat is the Jew has a role to be a light to the nations. How? By knocking on doors? No. Hold crusades. Don't bother. Inquisitions. That's not your field. You keep Torah and it will reach the world. You're asking, how could such a thing be? You could have asked that question thousands of years ago. Today, it's obvious what's going on. But in the Greco-Roman sense, Son of God really meant Son of God. And if you were the Son of God, that means you were literally conceived by God, So a lot of the people Hercules was, his mother in a very interesting way was impregnated by Zeus. And those like Romulus, the founder of Rome, was said to be born of a virgin, and Alexander the Great, born of a virgin. Rome did not convert to Christianity. Rather, Christianity converted to Rome. It adopted these accretions that emerged from the Christian world as time went on. That's why early stages of the canon, the Christian canon, we are not, as we would expect, we would not find a virgin birth in none of the 13 letters of Paul. Those are early. In the book of Hebrews, we are not to find a notion of a virgin birth. Hebrews is earlier than the Gospels. No virgin birth there. No virgin birth in Q, which almost certainly is older than Mark, likely is. It's what you'd expect. Mark was written about the year 70, the time when around the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. No virgin birth there in the book of Mark. We were introduced to Jesus as an adult at his baptism. Nothing there. And it's only in Matthew, Luke, late stuff that's like in the mid-80s. By the way, I'm being very conservative here. These numbers this is standard 80, 85. There are people who hold that Luke is much later. I'm not going there. I'm just keeping it nice and conservative. That's 85. Well, obviously what happened is at some stage, traditions are developing. And we see that all over the Gospels, and which each tradition is another accretion of another development. And this idea that Jesus born a virgin develops earlier than Matthew and Luke, and then independently in two different parts of the empire, the tradition develops further and further. And by the time Matthew has it, Luke has it, they are completely developed independently, and each of them, Matthew and Luke, use a different plot device to get Jesus to be born in Bethlehem, although everybody knew he's from Nazareth. That's the key. I mean, when you hear today Jesus of what? You don't hear people saying Jesus of Bethlehem. It's Jesus of Nazareth. So they were stuck with Nazareth, which is no doubt a real place in the northern Galilee, a one-horse town. And that's where the historical Jesus comes from. And each Matthew and Luke have to come up with a totally different plot devices. How do you get the family to Nazareth, but yet have the baby born in Bethlehem? And Matthew and Luke will go about that differently, and that's why they're different. When I say different, I don't mean different as in the Passion narrative. I mean the stories have nothing to do with each other, and to the credit of many evangelical scholars, they concede that, in fact, these are hopelessly unreconcilable. Thank you so much for your question. If you enjoyed this program, please like and subscribe.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא לעת נעשה בחפצו כל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא